So, on tonight's episode for the Rogues Retrospective Review, we're going to be talking about from 1984, the classic, in my mind, the classic action sci-fi adventure film, The Terminator. So, here just real quickly, The Terminator came out on October 26, 1984. It's directed by James Cameron. I'll read the synopsis here from the almighty Google here just real quickly. It says, disguised as a human, a cyborg assassin known as the Terminator, played by Arnold Schwarzenegger, travels from the year 2029 to 1984 to kill Sarah Connor, who's played by Linda Hamilton. Sent to protect Sarah is Kyle Reese, played by Michael Biehn, who divulges the coming of Skynet, an artificial intelligence system that will spark a nuclear holocaust. Sarah is targeted because Skynet knows that her unborn son will lead the fight against them. With the virtually unstoppable Terminator in hot pursuit, she and Kyle attempt to escape. So in order to do a retrospective review, we want to start off with is we want to talk about how we originally heard about the film or actually became aware of it, and then talk about our initial impressions. And then we'll obviously talk about how we feel about the film today, having actually recently rewatched it. So tell me, Eric, how did you first hear about The Terminator?
So I have a kind of interesting story about my first experience with The Terminator that's actually a very vivid memory in my head. I don't quite remember what year. I know I didn't see this film in the movie theater. I was not allowed to watch rated R movies when this film came out. I was quite young, and I wasn't really supposed to be watching rated R films until I was, I think, almost a teenager, or at least like junior high type of age. So years and years ago, when I was growing up, I used to spend a lot of summers in Guadalajara, Mexico, because I have a lot of family in Guadalajara, Mexico. I have uncles, aunts, cousins, you name it. Got a lot of family over there. My mom's side of the family, most of them live there. They live in Guadalajara. So I used to go there quite often for summers as I was growing up, and usually I would stay with my grandmother, but every once in a while, I would actually stay with one of my uncles. And I have an uncle that actually was pretty well off, and I used to stay at his house with his sons, my cousins. They were my first cousins, and we used to have a lot of fun. And one of the things that we did that was kind of interesting for me is we went out to a local video store and we rented some movies one night. And at this time, I can't remember if we even had a VCR at my house, because I was one of those families where we were like one of the last people to get a VCR, and we didn't have VHS. We actually had Beta when we got our first video cassette machine. So in Mexico, I had this uncle who again was pretty well off. They had a VCR, and my cousins took us to their local equivalent of Blockbuster. Although I think those back in those days, United States and Mexico, I think most of these places were independently owned. They were owned by regular people. We went to their local video store, and this was one of the movies that we rented, which I don't think I was really supposed to be seeing at the time. I was quite young. It was obviously out of the movie theater. At that time, it took quite a while for films to come out on video cassette after they've been released in the movie theater. So it was definitely years after it had been released, and I got to watch it, at my uncle's house. And it was quite an experience for me because, like I said, at that point in time, I don't think I was even supposed to be watching rated R movies. And this movie, of course, has a ton of violence. It has nudity. It has all sorts of stuff, exactly the type of stuff my parents didn't want me to see. But hey, my cousins hooked me up. So that's how I saw Terminator. What about you, Dave?
Well, my first memory of The Terminator was actually seeing it on television. Not actually on VHS. It wasn't the R-rated version. It was a cut-down TV version. And then many years later, I remember seeing it on VHS. One of my most fond memories, actually, of The Terminator, and just to be clear, I just found The Terminator on one day while I was flipping channels. It wasn't like someone had told me about it or I had already heard about it. It was just on television, kind of the same way that I discovered Dune. It was just kind of on. So what's interesting, or my most vivid memory of the Terminator from like back in the day, was in high school. I had been elected the president of the science club, and I thought it'd be interesting to introduce sort of like careers and different things that you could have kind of through science. And so I thought makeup effects and stuff would be really interesting. So I made arrangements to actually have someone come in who actually did makeup effects for a living, to actually talk to our science club class about how he uses actually, science in order to create makeup effects for movies and such on and so forth. And I thought it'd be really interesting to have the Terminator be the film that we actually showed, because this would have obviously been after school. But it was really interesting because we actually watched the VHS version of the Terminator. They just wanted me to skip over or somehow not have us watch the sex scenes. Other than that, they didn't care, which I always thought was really funny. And then I couldn't figure out a better way to do it, so we just fast forwarded through the sex scenes. So still kind of saw them. Still kind of shocked I was able to get away with actually, watching Terminator at science club in high school. But it was interesting. And I've always liked the Terminator film ever since I originally saw it back in the day. And to me, it's one of those classics, at least in my mind anyway. It's one of those just classic science fiction films. It's kind of cool. I noticed back then, and obviously you noticed today, acknowledgement, to the works of Harlan Ellison, because the Terminator does lean on a lot of classic science fiction stories that had been around. It just puts them together in a slightly different way and repackages them in a way that at times is more compelling and maybe a little bit more exciting. But I did think it was neat. I remember even back then, I thought it was really cool that they acknowledged, the original stories that this is obviously borrowing from.
This is the first time I noticed that. I didn't notice that before. And it's interesting because I think the only reason I did notice it this time is because of the previous review that we did on the City on the Edge of Forever comic adaptation of his original screenplay.
Yeah, no, I just thought it was really neat. I just remember even back in the day, the fact that they actually took the time to acknowledge, Harlan Ellison's, contributions, to the film. I always love seeing that kind of attribution, in a film or a TV show or whatever, created by or whatever. I always thought that was really kind of cool and interesting.
I wonder if today you could do that kind of credit. It seems to me that if you did that kind of credit today, you would get some sort of lawsuit. Because as far as I know, I don't know of Ellison doing any kind of lawsuit against Terminator. But I feel like today you might not be able to get away with something like that because they were basically crediting him as an inspiration, which you don't see that very much anymore, and I think that's for legal reasons.
No, I could see that. So in order for it to be a retrospective, obviously we have to talk about how we first heard about the film, how we felt about it then. And then we want to talk about how we feel about the film today and discuss our recent experiences actually reviewing it, obviously here for the show. So with the Terminator, what's interesting is I actually watched this actually as a part of my Amazon Prime subscription. And the only reason I watched on Amazon Prime, because I do own it on DVD, is because a few days prior to watching the Terminator, I had actually had Stargate on, and the original movie with Kurt Russell and James Spader. And the thing that was kind of disheartening was that my DVD is so old that transfer is awful. It's like trash. So I actually watched a little bit of Stargate opening sequences and such, actually on Amazon Prime, to see if they had a better transfer or a better version of it, and to see how much of a difference it made. And it made quite a difference. And so when it came time for me to watch Terminator for the film, watch the film actually for the show tonight, I thought, well, let me just go ahead and watch on Amazon Prime and see if they have like a newer, later transfer, because my DVD is kind of old. So, of course, I watched it on Amazon Prime. That's how I watched it. And in my mind, the film still holds up. I mean, there's some pretty dated kind of effect shots here and there. And even though I consider this film a classic, you can definitely, quote unquote, see the man behind the curtain in some of the shots. While, they worked really good for television, the original way I saw it, seeing them as they continue to transfer and update these films, to the newer medias, the sort of unfortunate, we ran out of money, we still got to get this shot in, sort of nature of some of the effects. Well, that's not true. I think at the time the effects were definitely state of the art.
They were cutting edge at the time. They were absolutely cutting edge at the time.
But I do know too that they were on a little bit of a budget with this one. The next one, they definitely had more resources, and I think some of the shots actually just kind of suffer a little bit from the fact that maybe they didn't have the kind of budget to pour into this that maybe they would have liked. But it's still a very good looking film, and I do feel like it's very, very much a classic, an 80s classic, and definitely sort of not just time travel, but just truly a great science fiction classic film from top to bottom. But I would just say there's definitely some spots, some effect shots that have definitely not aged very well. But other than that, I found the film to be very rewatchable. It's a lot of fun. That classic scene still kind of cracks me up where the Terminator shows up. Spoiler alert. The Terminator shows up at the police station, and he's talking to the guy who's kind of checking people in, and he kind of looks around. He's like, "I'll be back," and then he drives his car right through the front of the police station. That's still such a kind of a fun. I always get a snicker out of that.
I think people who, although I don't think there's many people that haven't seen this film, I think people, if there are any, they still know that scene because that line is used by Arnold Schwarzenegger in almost every film he's in. You know what I mean? I'll be back. It's a catchphrase.
And this is the film that started it.
Right.
No, yeah, it's still a very fun and watchable film. I did find it, because I know that Arnold walks to the police station and kills a bunch of the cops, as a part of the story. I did find some of this to be a little bit more, not really shocking because I knew it was happening, but I did find myself having a different resonance to it and responding to it in a different manner than when I was younger. When I was younger, you're just enjoying watching the Terminator tear through people. But with everything going on in the world today, it takes on kind of a different context when you're watching what's happening. At least that was my personal experience. But I would definitely say upon revisiting the Terminator, this is a film I watch, again, every couple of years. And by watch, I mean it's actually on in the studio while I'm working. Sometimes I'm not paying super, super focused, laser gun sight attention, to it while it's on. It's just kind of on and I'm listening to it. But I do, like I said, consider this to be a science fiction classic. So tell me, Eric, having recently rewatched it for the show here, how do you feel about the Terminator?
I think my experience is very similar to yours. I myself also own the DVD version of this film, and it's actually a great addition because it has a lot of deleted scenes in the DVD version that I have. And I watch this film, from time to time, quite often as well. But for the show, first of all, I hadn't watched it in, I don't know, several months. It's been a while since I've watched it, even though I do own it. And I decided to watch it on YouTube because right now this film is available on YouTube with ads for free. So I thought that was interesting because I haven't really watched like an official movie on YouTube before, I don't think. I may have watched some pirated stuff on there before because I couldn't find it anywhere else, which, by the way, I don't advise people to do that, but because, that's not nice. But I have done it. But this one is officially licensed on YouTube right now to watch for free with ads. And what's nice about that is that it's free, don't have to pay anything. And like any other YouTube video, you can skip through the ads after the first 5 seconds, which is in huge contrast to services like Crackle, Pluto TV, other services that we've talked about on the show, which, by the way, we do advocate for. We do advocate support of Pluto TV, of Crackle, of Tubi, because these are ad-based services and they're free. And so we've tried to highlight them and their content on this show. But YouTube kind of takes it a step further in terms of enjoyment because you only have to watch about 5 seconds of the ad and then you can skip through it. So I thought that was interesting in terms of my experience in watching it today as someone who does watch the film quite often. But there's so many points I agree with you, Dave. I think you just hit the nail on the head. Specifically with the dated effects. First of all, I think the effects are actually superb in this movie, except in the last act. There are 3 defined acts in this movie. There's sort of the beginning where they're all kind of separated, and we have to get them together, and that's the first act. The second act is basically almost completely entirely that massacre in the police station, which I completely agree with you as someone who was a police officer for 20 years, that scene takes on a very different resonance today, in the contemporary world that we're in and how things are going right now in the world. There's a sort of third act that begins, as they're on the run after Reese has his last flashback. And that's one thing you didn't mention, Dave, was those flashback scenes. I think those flashback scenes are superb. I think they are done extremely well and totally stand up to today's standards of special effects. And the reason is because they are basically practical effects. And they were done with, like models, and they were done with set pieces. There's that iconic image, I can never get out of my head, of when it's that last flashback that Reese has, where we get to see the living conditions of the typical human beings in this world, in the future world, which, by the way, always fascinated me. I was always wanting to know more about this future world. And it's so funny because we've had so many Terminator films, many of them of very poor quality, in my opinion. But we've had so many Terminator films, we've never gotten another focus on that future world as it was shown in this movie. And I think there's a lot of fans like myself that are still thirsting for that. And there's that iconic scene when we show the living conditions of the typical humans where they seem to be watching TV. Do you remember that moment, Dave?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, I had a conversation. My wife actually quite likes the Terminator films. And we had a conversation about the fact that we feel like, as just you had just pointed out, and I totally agree, it's definitely in my opinion, I feel like that there are a lot of Terminator fans that, for example, went to Terminator Salvation hoping to get that experience, getting to, spend time in sort of Kyle Reese's and John Connor's world. That version of the future that we're shown, in glimpses here in Terminator and shown a little bit more of in Terminator 2. And that's the version of the future that everyone wants to see. Everyone wants to, I think a lot of Terminator fans would love to see a story set in that time, whether it sets up.
I want to see them with the plasma rifle in the 40-watt range. What I mean? Exactly. I want the plasma rifle. Because that's one of the big things with Terminator Salvation that I think was disappointing was, they're using contemporary weapons and things like that. And people are kind of like, I get it. Because Terminator Salvation was supposed to lead to another trilogy. I mean, that was the original intent. It just didn't work out. It didn't happen. And so they were trying to set up the story, obviously, and they were trying to show sort of the beginning of the resistance, which doesn't really coincide much with the original film version, at least in my mind. It seems different. But then again, I guess it would be different because of the events of Terminator 2. But still, we've never really got to see that future world. And I just want to emphasize that I think those effects are superb. Where it falls is in the third act. In the third act, when they're being chased by the Terminator for the final conclusion, there's several scenes specifically where they're using stop motion. And the stop motion actually works pretty well because the Terminator is supposed to be injured. He's actually lost all of his skin, and now it's just the skeleton, essentially, of the Terminator, and he's badly damaged. And so they did that in stop motion. It's very obvious that they did that in stop motion. Where it falls short is those scenes where they have the human actors and the stop motion together. Those are the ones I think that are the glaring kind of effect shots where you're like, wow, that's really dated. But what I thought was interesting about that is obviously that was done with that sort of back screen technique. They obviously combined two special effects processes, one being the stop motion to actually make the Terminator walk, because they didn't have an actual animatronic Terminator that could walk. So they did some sort of stop motion with that. But then they used that back screen, that very old technology, which we've talked about in The Mandalorian, has been updated. And I couldn't help but think when I was watching that, like, what if they had the back screen technology, like they have now with The Mandalorian, and could have done that scene with, a stop motion Terminator, with the actors. I wonder if that would have worked, because obviously in The Mandalorian, they use that technology almost exclusively, as far as I could see, for a background. And I'm wondering, what if you tried to combine those two things together? That's always why I kind of think about, like, a lot of these classic films could really use some sort of an update. You know what I mean? Where if they could use some of the technology we have today to kind of clean up a couple things. But then that gets into the whole argument of, like, what George Lucas did with his remastered Star Wars films, and how a lot of people hate them. You know what I mean? So it is kind of a controversial subject, but I think that's the main special effects scenes that I saw that kind of take you out of it a little bit. But what's great about this movie is once all of that is over, the ending scene to me is so powerful and so emotional to me. And actually, to me, it's philosophically profound, the very last scene of this movie, that it really puts it all back together. And so watching it today, I definitely still have a great experience watching this movie, and it is definitely a classic, a well-earned classic. Manasan had a comment where he was saying, we've already seen crossovers like Alien versus Predator. I wonder if Terminator will ever be added to that mix. The original had a strong tech noir feel, and the T2 sequel was an over-the-top action hit. And Manasan, I think I agree with you there. There is a difference in tone between the original Terminator and Terminator 2, specifically a lot with that last scene, although the last scene of Terminator 2 has its own little philosophical message as well. I really liked what they did at the end of the original Terminator, as you say, that sort of tech noir. But as far as like a crossover, you know what came up in my head, which I think this seems a little bit obvious, but I've never heard anybody say this, but Reese was also in Aliens, right? I would kind of like to see the Colonial Marines take on a Terminator. What about you, Dave? What do you think of a crossover?
Well, I think a crossover makes a lot of sense. For me, the crossover I think should happen is actually the crossing over RoboCop with the Terminator. Not because of the Mortal Kombat video game per se, but more so because Dark Horse actually back in the day they actually published a really fun comic book series that basically was RoboCop versus the Terminator. I think that's, for me personally, that's what I would like to see explored. If they were,
that's a natural matchup. That's a natural matchup. I mean, I can't tell you how many kids and stuff like that, growing up, that's just a natural matchup. Who would win in a fight, the Terminator or RoboCop? You know what I mean? They're both cyborgs. Right. But you know what I always thought was interesting is they're reverse cyborgs of each other, right? Because RoboCop starts, his basis is the biological components. He's got a human brain. The Terminator cyborg is completely reversed, where we're looking at a computer brain with human skin and human organic compounds and a artificial skeleton. So I always thought that was fascinating too, that they're both cyborgs, but they're mirror images of each other in every way.
Right. No. Yeah. And to me, that's just the crossover I would most like to see. It's the one, like you said, that makes the most sense. Again, in my opinion. No. Yeah. I mean, I've just always felt like that's if you're gonna cross it over, I could see that. But again, the Terminator, because of how interconnected everything is, and through Michael Biehn, I mean, you could do some kind of a Terminator Alien, sort of a thing.
Yeah,
I mean,
let's see Reese with all his fancy gadgets and stuff taking on the Terminator instead of
yeah,
a sawed-off shotgun. You know what I mean? And some homemade plastique. You know what I mean? Let's give him an upgrade. You know what I mean? That would be kind of fun.
right.
And obviously, like I said, he was in Aliens, which is one of my favorite movies. That's another one that I own. And as I mention on the show all the time, if I own something, that's really personal high praise for me because I really don't have a huge collection of DVDs or Blu-rays. I have a fairly modest collection of movies. And so if I own it, it's either something that somebody gave me or I found at a yard sale, which means it's like practically worthless to me, or it's something I really, really appreciate.
No, yeah. I mean, I could definitely see that. Um, and then we actually have a comment actually from Jane. She said, and she's referencing Dave after Terminator Universal experience changed the way you felt watching it. So you're asking, let me rephrase this just a little bit. My mom is basically asking if after watching and experiencing the Terminator Universal experience, which was actually at the Universal Studios as a part of the tour, did it change the way I felt watching the movie? Well, watching this particular movie, I'm going to say no. It does, however, affect how I feel about not just watching Terminator 2, but actually the films that actually come after. Like, for example, like Rise of the Machines, the Terminator experience at Universal always felt like it was in direct conflict with Rise of the Machines based off of what we know supposedly causes, the AI to become self-aware and what they show us kind of at the Universal experience. But getting back to the original Terminator, I mean, to be honest, I don't have much more to say other than just that this film it's just a classic. And I love the ideas of the crossover. Of course, what my mom's referencing, which is the Terminator experience at Universal. I don't even know if that still exists still or not. But if it does, for me, it's still one of the coolest things because it ties in so closely with Terminator 2. And those are the things I find as the most interesting sort of extension of the film. Because, James Cameron was involved. It's considered a direct sequel. Obviously, we have Arnold. We have a lot of the actors from T2 kind of reprising their roles. And it very much, brings a new element, a new dimension to the story. And feels most the quote unquote, in my mind anyway, sort of in canon. For those of us that are big, canon aficionados in terms of, legacy of the characters in the story and moving it forward. But no, and tell me, Eric, did you ever get a chance to go to Universal Studios and do the Terminator experience? Are you familiar with what we're talking about at all?
I'm familiar with it, but no, I never went to Universal when they had it. I've been to Universal Studios in LA and also in Florida, but I don't think this attraction was actually a thing when I went. I was too little.
Oh, okay. It was really cool. I don't know. I don't even know if it still exists anymore or not, but it was really, really fun. At least for those of us that are fans of the Terminator, because you kind of stood in line to go inside Cyberdyne Systems, and then the main hall where the experience takes place. It's like it's a part of this again, just Cyberdyne in general. And then these Terminators come out of the floor and they battled each other and stuff and everything. It was really pretty cool.
Was there anything without? I'm just curious. You don't have to give a spoiler or anything, especially because we don't know if the attraction is still open. But did it seem to contradict something in the movie?
Not really. I mean, it ties into Terminator 2 pretty heavily. I mean, it's very much an extension, actually, of Terminator 2. I was always surprised as all these other sequels and everything's come out. They've never made more of an effort to take that and make that a little bit more, quote unquote, in continuity where more people can experience it. Just because that whole thing was put together by James Cameron. You know what I mean? And it's very much his vision, and it does very much continue it very much continues the version of the Terminator I think most of us, love the most that we want to see more of. So, but no, it's pretty cool.
It's funny you say that because obviously, pretty much all the Terminator movies have featured Arnold Schwarzenegger. Technically, even Salvation did in a cameo where they used his image and stuff like that. Although, he wasn't actually in the movie. They just basically like CGI'd him into the movie. But there's always sort of this focus on the Terminator. Watching this movie, because I was talking about how much I love those future scenes and how much I really want to see a movie about that. And I feel like, man, why didn't they ever make like a Reese movie? And why does it always have to be about the Sarah Connor or her son or John Connor? Why couldn't they have made a Reese movie? Like, for instance, there's a scene in this movie, I was talking about it earlier, where we get to see how the humans live in that dystopian world, and they are attacked by a Terminator. And we never get to see what happened, how Reese actually obviously survived that encounter, because it almost looks like he gets blown up. But obviously he didn't. He's got scars all over his body. We can see that because he's naked, and the first time we see him in this movie, he's very scarred, very battered, obviously physically and emotionally. But I kind of would love, it's funny because there's been so many Terminator movies. It's like, why not do a Reese movie about him in the future fighting these Terminators? I think that would have been cool. Missed opportunity, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would have to say I would agree with that. And as I said before too, I mean, for me, those scenes hold up incredibly well. They're a lot of fun. One of the most iconic moments actually from any of the Terminator films, which I think they actually borrowed for the marketing actually for Terminator 2, actually happens in that same scene you're describing. There's a Terminator and he's kind of like walking down sort of this hallway of this area where people are congregating that are trying to survive, and you have some soldiers that are there, and he's wiping everyone out, and all you see is his glowing red eyes, and he's got the laser minigun or whatever it is, and he's blowing people away. That's such an iconic, in my mind anyway, visual. And then it's a visual that, again, for the marketing for T2 they tapped into, and actually for the Dark Horse comic books they actually tap into that iconography and use that for a couple covers kind of here and there over the run of the comic book series. But no, yeah, I mean, to me that makes the most sense. I think that's the thing most people would have liked. And I don't hate Salvation. I own Terminator Salvation. But that's part of the whole missed opportunity of Terminator Salvation. And it gets even more confused when you look at the Sarah Connor Chronicles, which was the television series, where they're trying to give us more information about John. They're trying to give us more information about Kyle. But when you watch Terminator Salvation, it's like Kyle's too old. And then when you watch Terminator Salvation, he seems like maybe he's too young, even though he would have been younger because he talks about surviving and scavenging in the streets, So I don't know. It's one of those things. It's like I think the obvious thing to do that people would love, for whatever reason, always escapes the filmmakers and their imagination when they're trying to think of things to do with this particular franchise.
Well, I think one of the problems, and you kind of touched it a little bit, is because of the time paradox issue. So for any of you folks out there that are hardcore sci-fi fans, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And there's less of that issue in this movie. There's obviously one big one that's clearly a paradox and is weird. But it's kind of also interesting. When I was watching this, I was thinking of like how Endgame treats time travel versus how the Terminator and Back to the Future treat time travel. And I was thinking in my head, if I were to reboot this, first of all, I would like to do the Reese thing. But I think I would also say, you know what? All these different Terminator movies you saw, they're all real. This whole time travel gimmick, it's just BS. Because basically every time they do this, they're going to a different parallel universe, and they're not affecting the events of their own universe at all, because it would be more of that Endgame version of time travel. I actually think that would be an interesting way to revamp the series if they ever chose to, which I think they will at some point. The Terminator never dies. Terminator never dies.
Yeah. No, I think it's an interesting idea. and something I think is worth exploring, and the Terminator is one of those franchises that, despite all the films that have been made and the people that are loyal to it that love it, it's not such a sacred cow, quote unquote, that you couldn't get away with, kind of attempting to pick up and move the story forward, as long as you do it in a respectful manner. You know what I mean? And I think for most people anyway, find a way to play homage, to the original film. But no, yeah. But again, just to sum up real quick, I would definitely say the Terminator is worth, rewatching if you haven't seen in a little while. It's definitely worth, getting back into this universe and this world. And this film's got a lot of fun, performances in it given by all the leads. And it's just a really fun movie. It's just a fun, and the Terminator time actually comes across as sort of like a serial killer, and it's kind of an interesting, weird sort of like sci-fi serial killer sort of story at the same time. So, but it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. I highly recommend people check out the Terminator. So tell me, Eric, would you feel the same way? Do you think for those people who haven't seen it, or maybe haven't seen it in a little while, that is definitely worth taking the time and revisiting the Terminator?
Well, I will say that if you don't like violence, if you don't like, there's not a ton of nudity, but there is nudity and things like that. If you're not into those things, you're probably not going to like this movie. But I absolutely believe it is a classic. It's a classic in a lot of ways because in some ways it crosses genre. I think most people think of this as a science fiction film, but in a lot of ways this is a horror film as well, especially actually in the last act. And I do think it's kind of interesting because the three acts to me are very defined in my head of this movie, and there's some differences in tone and things that are going on with the characters. In a lot of ways, that last act it becomes sort of a horror movie. The world literally seems to become smaller, and suddenly the rest of the city doesn't seem to exist. Literally, it just has that sort of complete change in tone in the last act. So again, I think it's a classic. I definitely would recommend it. But if you're not into violence and gore, and you're not quite into the whole nudity and sex thing, might not be for you.
I could see that. Do we think that's good, or do you have anything else you want to add on the Terminator?
No, I think the one thing I would mention is obviously some people out there may never have seen the original, and they may have seen some of the other films and not like them. I do think Terminator 2 holds up very well to this film. I do not hate Terminator Salvation. I think there are some good things about that film. I actually like, what's the third one, Dave? Is that Rise of the Machines? Is that the third one?
Yeah, that's Rise of the Machines.
So I thought Rise of the Machines was actually pretty decent because I liked what they did about explaining what Skynet actually was and what happened. I thought it was a really good twist. So there are elements that I like, but I know there's people that hate a lot of these movies. And so if you're one of those people that maybe you've only seen Terminator 3 or you've only seen, 4 or, God Help You, Genesis or the last one, and that's the only one you've seen, and so you've never checked out the original, give the original a try because the original, I think, is arguably the best, although there could be an argument there with Terminator 2 for sure.
Yeah, I would definitely have to say I totally wholeheartedly agree with Eric's assessment. I think this film is definitely worth revisiting, and especially right now too. Like if you can watch it on YouTube for free, why not? Go give it a try and check it out if you haven't seen it. And then number two, if it's been a little while since you have seen it, that's a fun way to see it again and get back into the world of the Terminator. So,
right on, absolutely.